the normalization and glamorization of platforms like this and pitched as easy money, people who wouldn't otherwise necessarily be typically vulnerable are becoming vulnerable.
Welcome back to the Change Reaction Podcast. I'm Matt West. Now, we get into some pretty deep conversations here on the show, but nothing quite like the conversation you're about to hear with Harmony Dust. She's a survivor of commercial sex trafficking who now leads a very powerful outreach and support group for women in the sex industry and survivors of sex trafficking. Now, there are some fairly spicy topics here, so if that's not for you, you've been warned. But I think you should stay to give it a listen. Let's get into it. Wade, great to see you in the studio, my friend.
Good to be back, always.
I love a redemption story. I love a survivor story. Harmony Dust, welcome to the Change Reaction Podcast. Yours is quite the tale. It's a redemption story. It's a survivor story. And there's so many layers to the things that you are involved in and the work that you do. Instead of me telling you where to begin, I want you to tell me where we should begin this conversation today.
Wow. I think the thing that comes to mind is lately I've been getting a lot of messages from women who have not yet broken the silence about their trauma. And I think where I would start is this very critical defining moment in my life. And it's funny because I don't cry very easily, but this one's, I think it's very tender at the moment. And I remember and I'll get into the backstory, but I had a huge history of trauma that led me to be exploited by a pimp. And I was vulnerable as a teen, which I'll explain in a minute. But after I got out of that life and escaped, I still remember the day I was driving through West LA, where I lived at the time, and I had my first flashback. And a lot of times for those of us with complex PTSD, when we're finally safe is when the trauma starts to surface, because we're finally in a place where we can face it, right? And I remember this critical defining moment where I had a choice if I was going to face my pain and if I was going to deal with it head on, or I could have kept driving and put it in the back and pretend that hadn't come up and move on with my life. And I decided to face my pain, and I decided to find a therapist and pay out of my own pocket money I did not have and drive in LA traffic to sit and talk about things I really didn't want to talk about. But because I really had a sense that I needed to get free and that I was going to be accountable for my journey because I was going to have to tell others about it one day. And I think back to that moment and like, what if I had stayed silent and afraid to face my pain? I wouldn't be here today doing the work that I'm doing. And I'm so thankful for the work I'm doing. If you know me, this is very unlike me. Tears do not come easily.
That's how a lot of this work starts for a lot of people that we talk to on the podcast. It's an experience that they had growing up. It's usually rooted in trauma. It's usually at the tail end of a survivor experience. And then they create the thing that they wish they had growing up. Yeah. Let's talk about what it is that you've created. You run an organization called Treasures.
Yes.
And it's survivor-informed trauma recovery resources for young women who have been in similar situations to yours, correct?
Absolutely.
But I think one of the things I want to ask you, because of your experience, is, you know, that term trafficking gets tossed around a lot.
Yeah.
And it kind of ends up being a blanket statement. And there's so many different facets of trafficking that happen. Certainly stuff that ends up in the headlines. There's human trafficking, immigration violations, child slavery, exploitation, all of these things. But there's this undercurrent of trafficking that happens that I don't think a lot of people are aware of. Can you share what your experience was and where your focus is with Treasures and how you're trying to change the conversation around that?
Yeah, I mean, when I was in grad school, once again, we learned about labor trafficking, and heard a little bit about sex trafficking, but it was like overseas. And that was the misconception, that it's something that happens in other places, but surely not here in America. And I wasn't even seeing myself through a lens of any of this. But ultimately, exploitation is when the sexuality or attractiveness of another person is used for someone else's financial gain. The difference between exploitation and trafficking is, in order for it to qualify as trafficking, there needs to be force, fraud, or coercion, or the person is under the age of 18 years old, in which case you don't have to prove force, fraud, or coercion. And it's happening here in our backyard. What people don't understand a lot of times is that 70% of female trafficking victims are trafficked into the commercial sex industry, including legal forms of it. So it's not, yes, it happens in these underground places and basements and places you might not see, right? But so often it's happening in plain sight. It's happening in legal establishments like massage parlors and strip clubs. We did a survey of the women that we serve, a voluntary survey, and 1/3 of women who had worked in strip clubs identified as victims of trafficking. They were under third-party control. An even higher percent said, no, I don't identify as a victim of trafficking, but I did have a pimp, which pimping is a form of trafficking. So even a higher percentage than that, right? Webcamming, OnlyFans. We're seeing more and more, like, the number of women Treasure serves has been exploding. And a lot of that is because, essentially OnlyFans and these platforms and webcamming is the new frontier of sexual exploitation. This is just another place where traffickers can meet demand. And that's what it's about. When there's not enough people who are willing to do this, then traffickers come in and they meet the demand by any means necessary, which means forcing, trafficking people into the commercial sex industry through force, fraud, or coercion. So, and it's happening most often to the most vulnerable in our society. Traffickers know how to identify traumatized people in foster care. 70% of domestic minor trafficking victims are from the foster care system. Why? Because traffickers know that's a population that is easy to exploit because of their vulnerability and because of their trauma. But a shift that I am seeing now is because of the rise of platforms like OnlyFans and because of the normalization and glamorization of platforms like this and pitched as easy money, people who wouldn't otherwise necessarily be typically vulnerable are becoming vulnerable because they don't have to leave their bedroom to be approached in DMs by a trafficker or a manager who says, hey, you're beautiful, I can help you make money, and don't worry, you don't have to do anything but do feet photos. And next thing you know, this person gets sucked into a life that they never expected and are doing things that they never expected. So it's something that people really need to be aware of, because more and more, it's always been the most vulnerable or the most susceptible, and that is still true. But more and more, we're seeing people that wouldn't be typically your victim, and they're ending up exploited and trafficked.
What really strikes me, one, thank you for sharing your story, and it's amazing what you've built, and facing your pain is a really hard choice. Mm-hmm. And so the courage that it took to do that, and it still takes to do that, is really inspiring. What really blows my mind is that there are people out there who are organized, because it is organized.
Yeah. There's
a formula. And what they're doing is they're monetizing on trauma.
Yes.
They're monetizing on vulnerability. And they see another human being or other human beings as a means to their end, which is cash in their pocket.
Absolutely.
And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about what it took for you to leave, and that financial, often, whether it's domestic violence, often in domestic violence, it's the financial aspect that keeps people stuck.
Yeah.
A lot of people ask, why wouldn't you just leave? Mm-hmm. Well, there's a financial, sort of, element to it. Mm-hmm. So can you address that a little bit? What does it take for a survivor to leave? I know it's different for everyone, but what are the complications?
It takes everything you have. I mean, and it's one of those things, it's not just, it's what you're doing for your livelihood. In my case, I wasn't keeping the money, but I still was like, there was something that felt good about being able to make it and know that I could make it if I needed to, and that I wasn't going to be hungry anymore. Mm-hmm. Like, that was big, right? Like, I remember my first night working, I was like, oh my gosh, like I have money for food. This is amazing, right? But not knowing, even when the money is good, the price is high. But of course, in my situation and many, my pimp was taking all of my money. But still, my car was paid for and my apartment was paid for and I had food in my refrigerator, right? So in that way, my needs were being met. But leaving it meant leaving, number one, a relationship. The trauma bond was so deep, I truly believe my survival depended on him. Because when I was 13 and I was a child, I developed that belief. My survival depends on him. He is who kept me alive and kept me safe, and therefore I owe my life to him, and therefore absolutely he can have all my money. I owe it to him, right? So that trauma bond was so deep. So it meant breaking away from a relationship that I truly believed, I'm talking viscerally believed, my survival depended on. I literally thought if I ever lost this relationship, I would fall apart. I'd unravel at the seams. I couldn't make it. And of course he was reinforcing this. No one else will ever love you. You can't make it on your own. You're dumb. You're, all this, this kind of mental game. It meant leaving all the people I knew behind because I knew I couldn't stay in contact with them and keep myself free, right? And then it meant having to face the fact that I had nothing to put on my resume, no employable skills, a huge gap in my resume where people are like, well, what have you been doing the past several years? Well, nothing. You know what I mean, right? And just, at every corner, it was obstacle, and complex PTSD, which means to this day, I'm uncomfortable alone in an elevator with a man. And that's something my body has just kept the score. Mm-hmm. And even if I tell myself, okay, I'm not going to be attacked, this could be a very safe man, my body still remembers the trauma. So then you imagine okay, now I've got to go interview. Well, what if the person interviewing me is a male and now I'm alone in a room with a man and I'm afraid for what's my safety? How can I have a successful interview when all that complex PTSD is coming up, right? So, and then when I left, I couldn't even get a job as a waitress. I didn't even because they require experience, right? I ended up getting a job at a group home in South Central LA, making just above minimum wage, working the graveyard shift. And I have to say, and also what a lot of people don't talk about is the financial abuse that happens in trafficking situations. Very often the trafficker is also pulling credit in your name, putting cars in your name, putting houses in your name. So by the end of it, I had 2 apartments in my name, 2 cars in my name, $35,000 in credit card debt, all that he had spent. And so now I've got to figure out a way to pay all the debt off. And I've got collections calling me about the car that I can't afford to pay anymore, but he's driving it and they won't let me get it back because his name's on it too. So it's a mountain to overcome. It's a mountain to overcome. And, it's not just the emotional trauma, but it's also how am I going to live now? And how am I going to put food on the table? And how do I fight to live and put food on the table when I'm overcoming the trauma? Which is why Change Reaction has been so vital. At Treasures, we provide recovery services in the form of support groups and mentoring and case management. And we've always scraped to put together a small budget so that we can help with emergency financial assistance, because we know often women are $200 away from homelessness. If their car breaks down and they have to now choose between getting their car fixed so that they have transportation to maintain their employment or paying their rent, what do you do in that situation? So when, we've always had a small fund to be able to help with situations like that, but being able to partner for the past several years with Change Reaction and being able to support people in those critical crisis situations when they are fighting so hard for the recovery, they are doing the work, they are taking the steps, and life just hits them and they're just 5 steps behind at every turn. Because of the support of Change Reaction, we're able to help them with those tangible, practical needs. We've been able to purchase flights for women to escape their trafficker and get safely put into residential programs. We've been able to help women get set up into their first apartment and get furniture for their apartment. We've been able to help women through the Upward Fund get vocational and educational training so that they don't have to work those just above minimum wage jobs, so they can be financially empowered to do better and then set their children up. It's not just about helping this generation of women break free, but it's also the generations that come. Their children, their grandchildren will be better off because they have the tools, the resources, and everything they need to overcome. If my mom had had the tools to overcome her trauma, I wouldn't be sitting here today.
Where does Treasures come into the conversation for these women who have been trafficked and exploited and abused? Is it similar to your situation where you had to make a choice and you had to be brave and you had to take a risk and walk away from it, and then you guys sort of step in, or are you finding them and helping them find their way out?
We meet women right where they're at. And that is very important. We provide services to women who have worked in the commercial sex industry and survivors of exploitation and trafficking. But regardless of whether or not they identify as a survivor of exploitation and trafficking, we provide services to them. The research shows that 89% of women in the commercial sex industry want out, but they don't see any other options.
Do women in the commercial sex industry see themselves as being exploited?
No, not typically, which is why we don't make that distinction.
Okay.
So for me, it took years for me to begin to see, oh my gosh, I was exploited, right? So for a lot of women, it takes a lot for them to begin to see the victimization. If there was victimization, if they were under third-party control.
But it's pretty clear that the commercial sex industry, more often than not, is exploiting young women and
Right.
people who are involved in it at some level.
Yeah, for example, 87% of women in prostitution are under third-party control. And so, but even for those who say that they're not under third-party control, there's no trafficker, there's no pimp, 89% want out but don't see any other options for survival. So what is choice without options?
All right, so just to be clear, though, how are we, for the purpose of this conversation, defining the commercial sex industry? Because that's a broad blanket.
So commercial, meaning there's an exchange of money,
Okay.
and sexual services. So it can be anything from escorting to street prostitution to webcamming to, strip clubs, massage parlors, legal brothels, anywhere where sexual services are purchased and there are commercial transactions.
And then where does it cross the line into exploitation and trafficking?
So if someone else is financially profiting from the attractiveness or sexuality of another person, it's exploitation. When you look at the whole beast of the industry, I think most of it could be really identified as exploitation. And then trafficking has to involve force, fraud, or coercion, or someone under the age of 18. But then there is obviously a group of people who would say, this is what we want to do for a living. We weren't exploited. We want to be here. It's our choice. Based on the research, that's only 11%. The rest are there because of poverty, because of vulnerability, because they don't have or see any other options.
How do you bridge that gap in understanding? If only 11% of the people who are involved in the commercial sex industry are not feeling exploited or have their own agency,
Yeah.
how do you create that conversation, and how do you create that level of understanding for the young women who don't realize that they're being exploited? Because it sounds to me, just even listening to your own story, like you didn't necessarily have the wherewithal at such a young age, trauma bond, coercion, all of these things, to understand that you were being exploited.
Well, first of all, we have so many women who want our services that we don't need to convince anyone. We would be busy for the rest of our lives just supporting the women who say, hey, I want out. I need help, right? And so I don't feel like it's my job to convince anyone. I feel like, we're here to serve women who feel like they need support and need services. And that's who we're here for. And at the same time, what I will say is that for myself, humans are so wonderfully complex, and we find ways to survive. And some of the ways we survive are with coping mechanisms like denial and justification and rationalization. So if you had come up to me at the time I was being exploited and said, do you like your job? First of all, I would say, yes, I love it. It's such great money. Because who wants to pay money to be with someone who's like, actually, I'm really depressed and I hate it and I don't want to be here. I'm going to lose your money right away, right? So first of all, I'm going to lie. Absolutely, I love it. It's great. I make so much money. And the other thing is, I would rationalize it, right? Like, and of course, my exploiter who gave me all this, you're a woman, you should use what God gave you. And if I were a woman, I'd do it too.
It's like a sales pitch.
Right. And why would you're being exploited working at Foot Locker because you're not making enough money. So it's this whole kind of ideology that you rationalize. so if someone had come up to me at the time, in the midst of my exploitation, there's nothing about me that would accept or acknowledge that I was being victimized in any way.
Was there a specific turning point for you? And do you find that when you talk to young women who are coming in and looking for the supportive services from Treasures, that there's a specific turning point where the light turns on and they realize this is not for me anymore? Or is it a slow progression and a slow realization?
I think it's different for everyone, and it is both and, because it was a slow progression of my thinking beginning to change. The way I saw myself started to change. And that was a slow progression. And then for me, there was a night where I had a moment of revelation. And, you know, I mentioned the night where I realized, oh, if I was created with a purpose, this can't be it. That was the first step. And then there was another night where I showed up and I felt vulnerable for the first time. All of the defense mechanisms and the armor and all my self-protection had really, and the dissociation, which I'm very good at because of trauma, had all worked together so that I never felt vulnerable when I was in the clubs. And one night I suddenly felt very vulnerable. I became hyper aware of how people were looking at me in a way that I had never seen it before. And it was like all of a sudden I looked around me and I saw everything through new eyes. And I actually was just about to like brush past it, and there was a man sitting in front of me, and I was about to tap him on the shoulder to see if he wanted to table dance. And right as I was reaching for him, the song Purple Rain came on. And it's the song that I had auditioned to, like as this clunky 19-year-old wearing clogs, not knowing what she was doing, terrified, shaking, right? And that song came on, and I remembered, like, my pimp had said, you only have to do this for a couple of months, and then you can get out. We just need enough money to pay this and that, and then you can get out. It won't be very long. And here I was 3 years later in the same exact situation, and nothing had changed. In fact, everything was worse than when I started. And I just took a step back, and it really genuinely was like I saw everything for the first time. I had been there for years, but I saw it for the first time. And I walked straight up to my manager and I said, I can't do this anymore. I've got to leave. And he's like, do you need the night off? And I said, no, I'm quitting. And he looked really confused, because the other thing about it is not only did people not leave, but I was one of the top earners in the club. Nobody leaves when they're a top earner. You might think about leaving when you can't, you're having a hard time making money, but I was a top earner in the club. And I remember going to the dressing room, and I ran into this woman, and she was like, what are you doing? I was like, I can't do this. I've got to quit. I can't be here anymore. And she actually grabbed me by the shoulders, and she was like, you can't quit. Go home, take a night off, come back. You can't quit. And there was something about that actually strengthened my resolve. And I was like, no, actually, not only am I quitting, but I am never coming back. And I went to the locker room, and I right then and there began selling my clothes. Because, I mean, anyone who's been in the life, like, you have to create this whole persona, and you have a wardrobe, and you have this whole character, right? So selling my clothes was actually an action of dismantling this identity that I had created for myself, and making it so that I didn't have an easy way back. I didn't have a suitcase of clothes I could just go work again tomorrow night, right? Like, I was making it hard on myself one by one, just stripping away this identity of Monique that I had created selling my clothes. And I left that night, and I never went back again until we started doing strip club outreach.
What was the impetus for you when you finally made the decision? You've sold the clothes. You've told yourself, I'm done. Mm-hmm. And you've talked about driving in West LA and having that kind of moment that you needed to get help.
Yeah.
And to start working through the trauma and start working through the experience that you went through. What was the impetus for then saying, I need to help other people? Because first you've got to save yourself.
Yeah.
You've got to clean up your own trauma, which
Yeah.
can take years. And like you said, it sounds like you're still working with a lot of things day to day, week to
Yeah.
week. When did it become a mission for you to try and help others?
Well, that was also a little bit of a gradual process. So the first thing is I went to volunteer in an orphanage in Mozambique, Africa. And they asked all of us if we would, at some point in the trip, share our stories. They didn't know my story. So the first place I ever shared my story publicly was in the bush in Mozambique, Africa. And I think I had to be that far from home to be able to feel comfortable doing it. And I watched every person there be impacted, and it was resonating with them and speaking to them. And I started to realize I needed to do something purposeful with my life. And I came home and I called this residential program I knew of. And I said, you know, I don't know what I'm supposed to be doing, but I think it has to do with women and children. What do you recommend I do to equip myself? And I'll never forget, they said, you know, most people here at the program have an MSW who work at the program. And I was like, what's an MSW? They're like, a master's in social welfare or social work. And I literally Googled it and applied for UCLA right then and there. And so I got accepted to UCLA, and I knew I was going to, you know, go into the field of social work. And I did. And in fact, not only did I end up working for DCFS, but I worked in the same office because I was in foster care briefly as a youth. I worked in the same office as my social worker from when I was a kid. And my supervisor helped me pull my case file. So that was a whole wild experience. So I knew I wanted to do something with women and or children. And then one day I was taking someone to the airport, and I got there early. So I pulled over, and I was sitting across the street from the club where I used to work. And I just was sitting there and thinking about the women and praying for the women. And I happened to have a stack of postcards in my console, and on the front it said, her value is far above rubies and pearls. And I thought, oh my gosh, I would love to go back to my ex-coworkers and just bring that message of encouragement to them and let them know that they're not alone, and you know, that I'm thinking about them. And so I just started writing handwritten notes on the postcards, and I knew where the women parked because they had a certain section where only the women could park. So my plan was just to, you know, put them on the cars. And the whole time I'm thinking, this is crazy. This is crazy, right? And I'm like, yeah, this is crazy. But I decided to do it anyway. And then I didn't think about, the security guard was like, hey, what are you doing? And I'm like, oh, I used to work here, and I'm just want to put little notes on the cars. And he was like, okay. And I was like, wow, that was easy. What if I could come back here with like little gifts? What if other people would want to join me? And I didn't even know what a 501c3 was. I didn't know what a nonprofit was. But all I knew is I wanted to do something. And so sure enough, I, you know, started gathering volunteers, and I found every strip club in Los Angeles and every strip club in in Las Vegas, and decided to do monthly strip club outreaches to LA and one annual trip to Vegas, and just started doing the work. And then someone on my team was an attorney, and she was like, why don't you become a nonprofit? That way you don't have to pay for all this out of your pocket, because that's what I was doing at the time. And you can get donations. And I was like, what's a 501c3? She's like, don't worry, I'll file for you. And she literally just like set me up with a nonprofit. And next thing you know, I'm like, oh, well, I better get a board of directors. And I bet, you know, so, and then eventually we were, my story, I was working at DCFS as a social worker and doing treasures on the side. And my story was featured in Glamour magazine, and it ended up being the largest story on a nonprofit in Glamour history. And women, our phone lines crashed, our website crashed, our email crashed, because women from all over the world were reaching out for help. And I took a week off work at DCFS and brought all my friends in the living room, and we had like a headquarters, and we were like trying to respond to all the influx of needs. And I was like, okay, I'll go back to work when this dies down. And it literally never died down, and it still hasn't. So here I am.
Yeah. What does that outreach look like?
Yes.
When you go to strip clubs in Vegas, what does that look like?
Yeah, so we go to every strip club in LA. We ended up training teams that now do Vegas. And we actually have trained organizations in 139 cities on 6 continents to replicate this trauma-informed model of outreach. But we go with gift bags with just like fun stuff, lip gloss, jewelry, that kind of thing. And the message that the women are loved and valued and purposed, and there's support available if and when they want that. And surprisingly, the clubs are very open to us because they know we're not there like, you guys need to get out of this. Like, it's like, no, if you need support, we're here. And if not, here's a gift to just let you know that you're loved and you're valuable. And, you know, I've had so many situations where women have kept our card for 7 years. And it's so funny, 7 years just seems to be the number, because so many women have said, I've had your card for 7 years, and now I'm ready and I need some support, and I'd like to, you know, get connected to your support groups. And, Yeah, it's beautiful. I love it.
When they decide to engage with you, let's talk about what that trauma-informed support looks like. And I think one of the things I'd love to understand too, because it means a lot of things in a lot of different circles, what does trauma-informed support look like at Treasures?
So it's a multifaceted. Number one, it means we acknowledge the role of trauma and how it's impacted us and how it impacts the women we serve. And so when we're viewing things through, a trauma-informed lens. And so, for example, if we have a party and a woman shows up and she behaves in a way that is like, what's going on, right? We understand she's out of her window of tolerance. Something activated her, and this is a trauma response. We're not like, oh, that person is this, that, and the other, right? It's like, oh, this is how her trauma is affecting her. And, in general, humans respond to threat with fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. So then you begin to understand like, oh, this person is activated. They seem to be in flight, right? Or this person seemed kind of aggressive. Well, they probably were triggered by something and now they're having a fight trauma response. And so then how do we help build resilience? How do we help teach women and ourselves how to regulate our nervous systems so that we can downregulate, so that we can stay in our window of tolerance, so that we can build a sense of safety within ourselves. So it's about recognizing the ways trauma is impacting us and how we respond when we're triggered, but also building resilience and learning tools so that we can start to cope more with the impact of trauma.
But to you, as somebody who's been there and really represents the apex of survival and turning trauma into purpose, what does success look like for these women who finally decide to engage with you?
I mean, success can look like so many things. Like I just think about recently receiving everything from receiving a message recently from someone saying, I'm setting boundaries for the first time, right? That is success. That's a huge win. To someone else who said, I left my trafficker and now I'm on the road to healing. To someone else, I just got a DM from a woman who is a part of our Treasures community for about a decade, and she just got her PhD in business. Like, so there's so many ways success can look, but of course we need to be able to name outcomes, which has always been challenging in a field where, success is so multifaceted and, we celebrate every win along the way. But what I will say is over 80% of women who have been a part of Treasures report having positive outcomes in their life and improvements in their well-being. The other thing is, I don't know if we've talked about this, but we are part of a longitudinal study along with a couple other Los Angeles-based anti-trafficking nonprofits utilizing the OHTS tool, which is basically the gold standard for measuring outcomes for the effectiveness of anti-trafficking programs across 14 different points. So it looks at, has there been increased stabilization in your housing? Has there been increased financial stabilization, improvement in your relationships, right? So across these 14 points, and we've been collecting data for 3 years as a part of this longitudinal study with a couple of other organizations. So eventually it's going to be a published article so people will be able to look at the outcomes, but also each organization will be able to communicate way more effectively. Like, here's what we saw after 3 years. Women who participated in this program saw these kinds of outcomes. So we're really looking forward to that.
That's got to make you feel pretty proud.
Oh, I'm so excited.
Something you've created is really being studied at a level of depth to maybe potentially be replicated.
That's true. That's a good point. I love it.
That's a beautiful thing. I'm curious, you've been doing this for 20 plus years at this point with Treasures?
Yep.
How many women do you think you've served in that time?
So I would say the first 12 years we weren't tracking as well as we could because we were really just like, how many women attended support group versus like all the women who are calling the office every day or the people I'm online with or whatever. So, I mean, on a very low scale estimate, the women and I'm not talking about women we've reached on outreaches because I think the number of gift bags we've given to women in strip clubs is like 87,000. And then the number of women we served is well over 8,000.
Wow, that's
with
still
like,
amazing.
with like true like recovery, case management, support groups, mentoring, and that sort of thing.
That's actually a pretty fantastic ratio,
Yeah.
considering.
Yeah.
I mean, that's you should feel really proud of the work that you've done there.
So thankful. And on top of that, like I said, I developed a training program that at first I was doing in person, and once a year I would do a training in LA, and the second time I would go internationally and train people to replicate this model of outreach and care and these best practices in their cities. So at last count, we had trained programs in 139 cities on 6 continents. And so now we get to equip people to also do the work. So who knows how many people, right? And then the other cool thing about it is like many of those programs use my memoir, Scars and Stilettos, as a part of their required reading. And then also we have a recovery curriculum called Live Free, and we just launched our first volume, which is Free to Thrive. And so a lot of recovery programs are utilizing our curriculum in their programs, so that they're actually, seeing outcomes there that we never get to hear about. And now that our support groups are virtual, sometimes residential programs will use our support group as a part of their programming. So they'll just set women up with laptops and headphones, and they'll attend our support groups virtually while they're in those residential programs.
It's wild.
It's really cool.
What does that feel like for you to know that you're actually making an international impact?
It's hard for me to get my head around. And, at Treasures, one of our values is the one, and that no matter how big it is and no matter how big the issue of anti-trafficking is, it's always about the one and doing for the one what we wish we could do for many. It's hard for me to get my head around the scope. But when I get to hear like each individual story, every time I think, if it was just for her, I would have written my book. If it was just for her, I would have started Treasures. But yeah, it's hard. Like even when I go to the airport or hotel bathrooms and I see the anti-trafficking hotline, like Treasures is one of the nonprofits that women get connected to when they call the anti-trafficking hotline. And, we've been a part of the movement that has made it so that those flyers are in bathrooms. Like it's hard for me to get my head around sometimes.
What do you want people to know so that for people who aren't aware of how young women are being exploited on a regular basis right out in the open, what do people need to see? What needs to change in terms of people's awareness?
I just had a little bit of a flashback that I haven't thought about in a while. And I'm going to answer your question. But the first thing I thought about is, I was actually just in Vegas. And so I was at the MGM, and every time I went to the bathroom, I saw those flyers. And I also saw women who I know were there, being exploited. And I know that every time they go in the bathroom, whether or not they're ready to get out or receive any kind of support, that is a message to them every time that says, you matter, we care about you, and if and when you're ready, there is support available. There is a way out. And the flashback that I had is when I was working in the clubs, there was this little, we actually had time cards where we had to clock in, which was unusual because usually you don't have to do that in clubs. And above the time card machine, there were pictures of missing children because presumably people are looking and wondering, are they working in strip clubs? Are they being exploited? Are they being trafficked? And I just remember I would stare at the photos of the missing children and I would just think, someone's looking for them. And there was something about that meant something to me. Like to know that someone's looking for you, that someone is there that cares, right? And so every time a person walks into a bathroom who's in a situation of trafficking or exploitation and they see that sign, even if they don't call the number, I really do believe that it means something and it's impactful, that it's a message saying we really care about this enough that we're putting this sign here for you.
Are there other ways that people who are just hearing about this and just learning about it for the first time through this conversation can potentially help women? Or is it the kind of thing where it really is down to the individual woman themselves to make the decision, I've got to leave?
Yeah, I see what you're saying. I mean, it's kind of both and. I think the thing I would say, the reason training is important is because sometimes if you do try to step in And you have to be careful because you could actually create more danger for
Sure.
that person, because you never know if their pimp is watching.
Or armed or
Right.
something, right?
Right. So like for example, on my drive to school, to take my son to school, driving down Sepulveda Boulevard in LA, which is a track, when you see young women walking by themselves at 6:30, 7 o'clock in the morning, you know, with just a small purse and, you know, usually an outfit that maybe is more revealing, like that most likely is a woman who is has spent the night on the streets and, you know, is finishing. And often there's also a trafficker nearby, you know. And then some other signs to look for is like if you see young people who suddenly have, you know, nice clothing or nice purses or their nails done or their hair done, and a new boyfriend, an older boyfriend, right? Like these are some signs. Someone starts isolating themselves a little bit more. So, you know, there are definitely signs to look for, but I would say on one hand, you have to be careful and you have to be mindful because you could put someone more in danger. At the same time, you know, stopping for the one is important. You know, there was a situation years ago where a friend of mine was at a park with her twin toddlers, and she's chasing the toddlers around, and she saw a girl there, and she just felt like something just felt a little off, and it wasn't convenient because she had twin toddlers, but she stopped and, how are you today? And how are things going? And as it turns out, this woman was a treasure. She had been in the life and, in fact, was in a very, I don't want to break any kind of confidentiality, but in a very desperate situation, and her life was on the line. I'll say that. And because my friend stopped to speak to her, she ended up getting her connected to treasures, and we ended up setting up childcare so that she could attend support groups. And, you know, we're able to come alongside her and resource her. And because my friend saw something felt off and decided to stop and just connect on a human level, not, and I'm going to come here and rescue you, right? But just connect on a human level, that woman's life is different today. So I would say there are those moments where if you see something and it feels off and maybe someone needs a kind word or a smile, right? Like, don't miss those moments because you never know what's going to be on the other end of them. And at the same time, let's not be vigilantes and go and try and like, hey, get in my car, I can save you right now, you know, because you never know. You could be that putting that person in more danger. But if people are interested in outreach, if people are interested in mentoring, Treasures has volunteer opportunities available for those things. And we train you so that you can do things in a way that you're equipped and are doing things in a trauma-informed way.
That's beautiful. Did you imagine when you first made the decision to leave the club and sell all your clothes and say, I'm done, that you would end up in this space where you're sharing your story, you're writing and selling a book, you're developing a curriculum that teaches people how to move on and live a life and live a life of agency and live a life of resiliency? Did you ever imagine that you would be here living the life that you're living now?
When I think about my younger self, I just don't think, no, I felt so hopeless. Like I said, I didn't think I would live to see 21. I couldn't imagine it. And yet I will say two things. Number one, for all of my mother's flaws and the mistakes she made, she always told me I was a world changer. It's just something she always said to my brother and I, you guys are world changers. You're going to change the world. And like, that was a gift that she gave me because I do believe that. She's no longer with us. I do believe that planted a seed in my heart. I don't know what you guys are doing today, but this is ridiculous. But that planted a seed in my heart. And then when I did get out and when I began my recovery journey, I had this weird feeling, and I kind of alluded to it earlier, that I was going to have to give an account for how I got free and what I did. And so when I was tempted to pick up the phone and call Homeboy again, when I was tempted to just go work one night to get my groceries paid for, I felt this sense that I would have to give an account for the choices that I made along the way. And I didn't know exactly what that meant. And I definitely didn't think it would be on this scale, but I did have a sense that I wanted my journey to help other people some way, somehow. But I never pictured this. And I didn't think I would be telling my story publicly, for sure. I thought I was going to just keep that one in a vault.
Well, it's an amazing story. And we're grateful that your journey brought you here today so that you could share a little bit about it with us.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming in.
Thank you so much for
Thank you,
having
Henry.
me. And thank you guys for all that you do. Seriously, it's transforming lives. Like, women have opportunities and a safety net that they wouldn't have had if it wasn't for Change Reaction and all the work that you're doing and the way you support Treasures. It's been so life-changing, and it's been wind in our sails as well, because when you are on the front lines and when you are experiencing secondary trauma, and you have that sense sometimes of hopelessness because you can't do everything you want to do, but you guys are helping us do more than we could, and it's really making a difference.
We couldn't make the impact at all without people like you. And so it's a true partnership, and we're so happy to do it. Thanks so much for your work.
So thankful.
You can read all about Harmony's story in her memoir, Scars and Stilettos, and find out about her work with Treasures by checking out the links in our show notes below. Big thanks to Wade Trimmer for joining me for this really powerful conversation today. If you're watching this on YouTube, we've got a ton of other incredible, inspirational stories on the channel, so give this episode a like, hit subscribe, and keep up with all things Change Reaction. Thanks for watching. I'm Matt West. We'll see you next time.